the first thing we're going to do is sew the center back together. So I'm just going to pin that. Okay. So you're going to sew a 1/2 inch seam allowance. You can use a 1 centimeter, 3/8 of an inch seam allowance if you like down here. I'm going to sew that and I'm going to finish it. I'm going to use my serger. You could zigzag it. This is the one place you could do a French seam. So you could do a French seam here if you like. I don't advise that because I think it makes the seam too stiff. And then the whole point of this shirt is that it's like gathered. But if you really like French seams or if you don't have a serger, then go ahead and do that. So I'm going to sew center back seam and finish it. Right, so I've sewn that center back seam. I used a 1 centimeter seam allowance and I finished it and I pressed it to one side. Now we're going to do our gathering for the center, into the yoke. So this, the notches near the edges, are for your start and stop gather points. That was mouthful. So run 2 gathering stitches between those notches. Now there's lots of different ways to do gathers. I've tried a lot of them. I've tried 1 row, I've tried 2 rows, I've tried 3 rows, I've tried, you know, there's tricks with like dental floss and all that stuff. I personally do not think that you get like nice gathers using anything but 2 threads. I don't know, I don't really understand why you would use 3, but I think 2 is the best. So I run 1 row of gathering stitch, and by gathering stitch I mean your longest possible stitch length. So on some machines it's a 4, some it's a 5. It's a very, very long stitch length, and you do not back tack at either end, and leave a pretty decent tail of thread on both ends. So one of the rows of gathering stitch should be a 1/4 inch from the edge, or about 6 millimeters, and the other one should be about 3/4 of an inch, a little over 1.5. It doesn't really matter. Basically you want those 2 rows of gathering stitches to straddle where your final row of stitching is going to be. So if you imagine, you know, it's going to gather up like this, and you have your 2 rows of gathering stitch, and then you're going to sew in between them. What that does is you can really arrange your gathers nicely, so they're totally even and no puckers and stuff, and it holds that in place like pins really nicely, and then you're going to sew in between, and it really does give you, I think, the nicest gathers. If you don't care, I mean, I actually really hate sewing gathers myself, but if you don't care, then do it whatever way you like, but that's my tip. So I'm going to run those gathering threads in and then show you how to attach the yokes. There we go. So you can see, hopefully, that I've got my 2 rows of gathering thread there. I'm not going to do anything with it until I get my yoke piece. So you have 2 yoke pieces. One of them we're going to call the outer yoke, and the other one we're going to call the inner yoke, but they're identical. If you're using a different fabric for the inner one, probably should have done that, but I'm not going to. I'm too lazy to cut out a second piece now. So the first thing you're going to do is take this yoke piece. So this is the neckline here. I'm going to take it and I'm going to pin it to one edge. If I can find my pins. Here we go. And then these notches here, the stop gathers notches, should match. So, and find like a nice long pin if you have a nice long pin. Find the longest pin you have and pop that in. There. Okay. Now we're going to shift it on over to the other side. Now you have all this extra fabric because that's going to be gathered in. I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. So take the edges, the sides, and match those up. and then match those notches and put, I don't really have another big pin. Whatever, I'll just put a pin in at this point. Now we need to gather this up. Be careful that when you gather it, you don't rip the gathering threads out. So what you can do to anchor it is just take, you know, this is not a hugely long piece of gathering, so I'm going to take these tails from this end, find the ones on the inside if I can. I can't, so I'm just going to find what I can. I've got 3 of them, that'll do. I'm just going to take them over to the front and wind them around my pin. I'm just making sure I'm not like puckering this edge down. I'm just winding them around this pin just to secure them so that I don't accidentally rip them out, because that is very sad. Then from the other end, I'm going to take 2 threads on the back and I'm just going to start pulling them. When I pull them, you can see it gathers up. So I'm just working on just that lower back panel, pulling a little bit and then snugging it up. What I like to do after I have a little bit of slack like this is I like to tie it in a knot, just so I'm trying to gather about even. I'm gonna flip this over now. There we go. So I'm gonna just keep pulling up the gathering thread and shift the gathers along. Now you can also do it in from the other side. I'm probably not gonna do that, I'm just gonna keep it anchored. This fabric is really easy to manipulate. You can just see how easily those gathers are chugging along. I can also see where that middle point was, where I folded the fabric, and so I can match that up with the center back, but I'm not going to do that just yet. Just going to get about the same amount of gathers on each side until it starts to fit. You can see I still need to snug it up a bit more. I just do that really roughly. Oops, that's even a bit too much. Do it about pretty roughly until I'm about matching, okay? But you can see obviously, you know, I don't want to sew it down like that. Okay? So now I'm going to start distributing these gathers. Once I have it about right, you can also just, to stop the gathers from like falling out, you can anchor it to the pin on this end, just like you did on the other end if you want. Just making sure it's about there. And this is not permanent, it's just to kind of hold it in place. So just gonna wrap it around that pin just a couple of times. There we go. And now I can start playing with my gathers without fear of them falling out. Now, take some time with this and get it right. If you want to, you know, you could have more gathers in the middle and less at the edges, or vice versa. But what we don't really want is some flat bits and some like super gathered bits. We also don't want these edges to be flipped under, so if they're wanting to flip under, I just kind of ease them out so they're flat. Okay, that's looking pretty even to me. Fix this edge a little bit. Okay, I'm going to flip it back over. And I'm going to match that folded line to my seam. And I always pin from the flat side. So you want those gathers, the gathers are going to go along the feed dogs, and that just basically helps it to sit nicer. So got my gathers, and then, oops, it's a bit tight. I'm going to just ease it off a bit. There we go. Make sure I don't have any puckers underneath there, and I'm going to pin. Wow, I don't know why I'm trying to pin with my left hand, but I am. So whenever you have something to ease in, it's always actually better to have the easing on the side of the feed dogs. You can see that the way I tied that thread off, it's kind of puckering that down. So I'm going to take this thread, this pin out and repin so it's flat. Pin this other side. Okay, so we've got that pinned along there. You just flip it over to check that nothing's like tucked under or anything. Everything looks good to me. So I'm going to go and sew that. Make sure you remember to decrease your stitch length back down to 2.5. I'm going to sew that with a 1/2 inch or 1.3 centimeter seam allowance. Right, I have sewn that. I'm just going to check. You can flip that yoke up and have a look at your gathers. You'll see that one of the rows of gathering thread is completely visible, and that is fine. What I'm checking is just along the stitching line to make sure that there's nothing, no bits of fabric that have kind of gotten caught up in there. We're not going to remove this just yet because we have to sew the other yoke on. So I'm going to flip that back down, and I'm going to turn the work over. And I'm going to find my other yoke piece. Here we go. So this is the inner yoke piece now. So I'm going to go, so this is the wrong side of the fabric. And I'm going to go right sides down so that when it flips up, we'll see that that's what we'll see on the inside. So I'm just going to pin this to that same seam line that we sewed, and we're going to essentially sandwich the gathers in between the yoke pieces, matching those notches again. Actually, I'm going to sew it, excuse me, I'm going to sew it from the other side. I'm going to just pin from this side, just so I can follow that same row of stitching. Start from the other end as well. It's a bit of a nest of threads there because there's all the gathering threads and everything. We don't have to trim them back just yet. Just see if you can deal with them. And that's because if you clip them back now or pull out your gathering thread and there was a little mistake, you will have to re-sew the whole gathering thread in again. So I'm kind of matching those center back points. So now we're going to sew that inner yoke on. I'm going to sew exactly along the top, over the top of that last row of stitching. If you missed it a little bit, it's not going to be a big deal. If you do miss it by just a tad, it's better to miss on this side than on that side. So err on the side of stitching to the left-hand side of it so that the stitches will be hidden. But if you have to do a bit of like going over it, it's okay. Right, so we flip that up. This is the outside. You can flip the yoke, the inner yoke up, just to check. So that's the inside. I'm not gonna need to do this on my fabric. No, actually, I will. I lied. So I'm going to grade this seam a little bit. I'm not gonna touch the gathers. I'm gonna grade some of the inner yoke seam allowance. I don't want to like mess up with my gathers because even though the gathers are bulky, I also think that grading them makes it bulkier in a way. You'll want to make sure you've checked your seam, that you didn't catch any bits that you shouldn't have before you do this grading. But I didn't. I just hoped it's okay. Okay, there we go. That's graded. I'm gonna flip both those yokes up. Now here's where we can remove that gathering thread. So try and pull the thread that you pulled first, which I think was this side. So just find that end and just pull it out like that. The other side will just come right out too. There we go. Clean up any frayed bits. These are just fraying edges of my fabric actually. I'm just gonna clip those away. There we go. So we have the gathered back of our shirt. So pretty. Okay, I'm gonna give this a press, just to press that yoke up. Okay, both the yokes up. And then when you're pressing, I'm gonna bring my iron over, but I'm not gonna actually touch it down. When you're ironing gathers, you're going to start where it's flat and then iron up towards that seam. It wants to iron. Towards the seam, but like using the point of your iron in between the gathers. Like don't ever like crush them like that because you'll get pleats, and this is gathers, not pleats. So you'll just kind of do each one, you know, like this. And then for the other side, for the yoke side, I'll use the iron just normally, but making sure I'm not overlapping onto the gathered part. So I am going to press it, and then I'm going to pin stitch along this edge. I just think it's a pretty edge, and I think it will hold things really flat and nicely. Okay, so I've pin stitched that back yoke and it looks lovely. Okay, we're going to start our yoke burrito process. So I've got my right sides of my back piece up, and I just realized I needed to tell you something. If you want to put a label in, now is the time. So I'm just flipping that outer yoke down. You would sew it to the inner yoke. Like if you're doing a kind of patch one, you'd sew it there. I'm not going to do a label today. This is fairly sheer fabric and I don't want to deal with that. So I'm going to take this inner yoke and I'm going to flip it down out of the way because we're not going to deal with that just yet. So I have my outer yoke here. So this is my right side of my back, my lower back and my upper my yoke. And then I'm going to go right sides together with my front piece. So the necklines match. We're going to sew it together at the shoulder seams. Using a 1/2 inch, 1.3 centimeter seam allowance. So this shoulder seam and the other shoulder seam. This fabric is pretty clear, right and wrong side, because there's a print on it. If your fabric is doesn't have a clear right and wrong side, at this time I would suggest very strongly that you check that the placket is correct. So that, you know, with the wrong sides facing up, that you've got the wrong sides of the placket. And you can see that hidden placket here as well. And then on the right side, you know, if I flip it over, it's all hidden and finished. Just double check that now. Okay, so I'm going to sew these shoulder seams, both shoulder seams, to the outer yoke only, using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Okay, we're going to do our burritoing procedure. So I have everything right sides up. So this is my lower back, my yoke, and my fronts. I'm going to start by taking this lower back piece and I'm going to just roll it up. And you know, you don't have to roll it perfectly like a Swiss roll. You can just kind of gently fold it up. Okay, you can see that exposes that inner yoke, which I have flipped down. Okay, so this is the outer yoke and this is the inner yoke here. Then I'm going to take each of these, front pieces, and I'm going to roll those up as well. And you just roll them up really just to get them out of the way so they fit inside the yoke. It's a fairly generous yoke, so it's not going to be tight. Okay, so I've rolled that front up. I'm going to do the other one. Okay, I'm just going to move this around so you can see. Here is the inner yoke, the outer yoke, the outer yoke, my rolled up pieces, and the inner yoke. I'm going to bring the inner yoke over the top of all that rolled up stuff. So that's because we need to attach things together at the shoulder seam. So essentially what you have is the two yokes coming around like this, and this is the shoulder seam, and then all of the other, the back, the lower back, and the fronts are sandwiched in between. So you can see it's making a burrito. So I'm gonna pin it together. I'm gonna pin it from this side where the stitching was, just like we did with the back yokes, just so we have a stitching line to follow. Even if you don't pin, usually this is a good place to pin because things can get a little shifty. I'm just going to pin it roughly for now and then go back and pin it more carefully from the other side. So bringing this inner yoke piece around, just giving it, I'm just going to put honestly just like 2 pins in just to hold it so I know what's what. Okay, I'm going to turn it over now. So this is, I can now see the stitching line that I had before. I'm going to move my pins around. I'm going to match up everything as nicely as I can. You want to just make sure nothing's kind of caught up in there that's gonna get caught in that seam. There we go, I'm gonna fix the other one, just make sure it's all okay. So it's pinning from the wrong side. There we go. So I'm going to sew this shoulder seam following that first row that I already sewed. So it's a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So sewing that all together. Okay, I have sewn those seams so everything's all enclosed. I'm just going to grade this shoulder seam a little bit. Please be very, very careful that you're not cutting any of your front away. So it's actually really hard to tell which is the inner yoke and which is the outer yoke at this point. I'm going for the inner yoke, grading that. Okay, and grade the next layer a little bit. Oops. Trim it back just a bit. You know, it should be about half the amount, which is always hard to do, honestly. It's harder to do the, I think, the middle one than when you're like trimming back more aggressively, but anyway. Other side. Okay, so here's where we're going to, it's a moment of truth where we see if our burrito worked. Make sure you're not letting things come out the neckline too much because we don't want to stretch that. We're going to turn it like the right way out through the side of the yoke, and that's a good way to do it just because it's less on the bias. It's not going to matter as much, it's not going to stretch as much. So we're just going to gently start turning it inside out. Just be very gentle as you do it. Don't yank. Just ease it through. I know it looks like a hot mess right now. There we go. It's like birthing a baby or something. Okay. There we go. So that worked really well. Thank goodness, because I'm demonstrating. Okay, so we have our yoke, our front piece, our lower back. Here's my outer yoke and here's my inner yoke. So from the outside you can see it's totally clean. If I flip it over so you can see the inside, it's still totally clean. Everything's enclosed in there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give these shoulder seams a little press. And I'm going to pin stitch, edge stitch on the yoke side of that shoulder seam. So on this side, I'm just going to pin stitch or edge stitch along there.